Hey, what's going on, kids? So you asked for it, and here it is. This is the masterclass on comma rules for the digital SAT. Now, in order for you to get the most out of this class, you're gonna have to do me a favor, and you're gonna have to play full out. So whatever I ask you to do, make sure to please do to the best of your ability. If you just kind of watch this passively and don't really think about or do the things that I ask you to do, you're not going to get much out of this class. Okay, so make sure to play full out with me. That way, you'll be able to learn these comma rules extremely well. You may need to watch the video over again, but that's okay because the more that you watch it, the more that you hear me talk about these comma rules, the more that you hear me kind of explain, right, how to use commas correctly and how not to use commas correctly, the more you'll be able to kind of remember that, right, information. You'll be able to hear my voice in your head when you're taking this test. All right. So you guys, if you guys struggle with commas for the SAT or just in general, this video is going to help you guys out tremendously. Okay. So first thing that I want you guys to do is look up here on this screen and read this sentence for me. Now, really, don't just kind of sort of do it. Like, actually take the time, pause the video, and read the sentence. Now, when you're reading the sentence, I want you to ask yourself a couple of things. So first, I want you to ask yourself, does this sentence make sense to you? Okay, because sometimes this is a very, very long sentence, and a lot of times the longer the sentence is, the more words there are, the more confused students get. Okay, so if this sentence does not make sense to you, then we have a little bit of an issue, right? You have a little bit of issue understanding or comprehending long, complicated, complex sentences. Second thing that I want you guys to do is ask yourself, is this sentence written correctly? In other words, does this sentence follow all of the grammar rules? And are the punctuation marks used correctly here? Okay, and if you're pretty sure about that, then the third thing that I want you guys to do is ask yourself, what is the purpose of each comma? We're going to be talking about comma rules today in this class, but what you can do here is ask yourself, like, what the purpose of every comma that you read or come across is. Now, you have to, if you don't know the answer to that question, right, then you're going to have a hard time solving punctuation and sentence structure questions on the digital SAT, especially for the medium and hard level questions, right? So, and that's what we're going to really talk about today. You know, by the end of today's class and maybe a few more classes afterwards, when we really dig into and actually practice training and helping you kind of train for punctuation questions, maybe after a few more classes, you'll be able to kind of learn or understand or be able to look at a sentence like this and know exactly the purpose of every single comma, right? Like what each comma is kind of used for, okay? And that's going to be the purpose of this video. Now, if you're thinking, well, Jen, there's no way the SAT is going to test me or give me this type of sentence, right? You'd be mistaken. But you'd be surprised, you guys. Yeah, I have read about 80 to 90 word sentences, right, on the SAT, where the entire passage that the SAT gives you is just one long sentence, right, that just has multiple, like, independent clauses in it, has a bunch of different punctuation marks in it, like you see here. It's got dashes with colons and commas, and a lot of commas too, right? So don't think that this is unrealistic. I have seen sentences get extremely complicated on the test. So you're going to have to know, you're going to have to be able to not just know punctuation rules, but you're going to have to master them. And today is going to be a very important step for you guys to take in mastering punctuation rules. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into it, you guys. So this today's class is really going to be all about comma rules, right? So commas have a lot of different rules. Right now, there's probably close to 30 plus comma rules in the English language. Now, here's the thing. We're not going to talk about every single comma rule in English. So this class isn't going to be like a normal grammar class where you're just going to learn comma rules. Instead, everything that I tell you guys in this class, every single thing that we talk about commas in this lesson is going to show up in your test some way. So everything that we talk about here, all of the comma rules that we discuss, right, are exactly what the SAT will test you on, okay? Now, they might not test you on everything that we talk about for every single test, but just know that everything that I mentioned in this class is stuff that I've seen the SAT test you on, right? On a previous exam or a practice test. Okay, so everything is going to be relevant. And I'm not going to include anything that I've never seen the SAT test on before. It's everything that we talk about here is going to help you out in some way on the test, right? So I want you guys to make sure you have a notebook ready and you have a writing utensil because you're going to want to take notes on each of the comma rules. I would also recommend you watch this video multiple times, right? And also share the video with some friends, right, who might need this. Be a good friend and share it with them so they can kind of get the value, right, learning these punctuation or comma rules as well. Okay. Now, before we jump into the actual rules, I want to give you guys a little bit of information about who I am. So if this is the first time that you're seeing me, hey, it's nice to meet you. My name is Jin Bae, and you guys can just call me Jin Teacher or Jin Sem if you understand some Korean. Now, guys, I've worked in one of the most, if not the most academically competitive environment in the world, Seoul, South Korea. And I've taught there for over 14 years and worked with over 7,000 students during my time there. Okay, I've also helped hundreds, I've helped hundreds of students score in the top 99 percentile on standardized exams like the TOEFL, the ACT, and the SAT, right? And I also myself, right, am a top 1% score on the verbal sections of the SAT, the ACT, and the GMAT exam. I'm also an author of a test prep strategy book for the SAT, a digital SAT practice test book, as well as like an ACT English, right, study guide and practice test strategy book as well. And I've also created thousands of practice questions. I'm also a content creator. We're not just creating like YouTube videos. This is actually the thing that I'm actually worst at. But I'm a content creator in the sense that I've created like thousands of practice questions, that type of content, test prep content for not just my books or my resources, my classes, but for other institutions, right? For other test prep platforms and things like that, right? Participating in mastermind groups and things like that. Okay, so it kind of gives you a sense, a little bit of an idea, that I kind of know what I am doing. Now, guys, my number one goal, my main priority, my number one focus for each and every one of you guys is to help you to miss fewer than 5 questions consistently on the verbal section of the SAT. So the verbal section of the SAT consists of the evidence-based reading and writing section, right? That's my goal for every single one of you guys. It's totally possible. I can't do it all myself. I can't do it in one night, right? It's going to take some time, right? And you're going to have to help me out because, I don't see you guys on a daily basis, and I don't know who I'm talking to on the other side of this screen. So you guys are going to have to communicate with me and tell me what you guys want to learn. Tell me what you're having trouble with, right? And then I can pretty much guarantee you that I have the answer to every single question that you want to know, right, on the verbal section of this test. I've spent over 10,000 hours studying for, preparing for, teaching, and taking these tests. And so I have a little bit of an idea of what to do, right, or how to do things to really put yourself in a position to be successful on the SAT. Okay, but this is my goal. I want to help millions of you guys out there at a very, very, very affordable cost, because I know test prep is not cheap, and I really want to make this accessible to the world. And so this is going to be my goal for you guys. Now, here's the thing, you guys. Let's jump into commas. So the very first question that I get for commas is, well, first of all, I get multiple questions, but one of the first questions that I get is, my students ask me, well, Jin Teacher, why are there so many comma rules, right? And so it's a matter of fact that the comma is the punctuation mark in the English language that has the most rules to it. Okay, and that's because the commas can be used in so many different ways for so many different purposes. Now, if you've ever been taught, just put a comma wherever you want to pause or wherever you want your reader to pause, right? That is not very good advice, right? That is not a very good piece of teaching that your teacher taught you with. Okay, now commas can be used for pauses, but you don't just want to put them randomly whenever you want to pause or whenever you feel like you should pause or you want your reader to pause. Okay, commas follow very specific rules, right? They have very specific rules that they must follow. And that's what we're going to talk about here today in this class. Now, the next question that I get from students is, well, teacher, like studying commas is really hard. I have a hard time memorizing them. Can you share any sort of tips with how to learn commas a little bit more easily? Right. And so definitely can. So that's what I want to talk to you guys about here. As when you're learning comma rules, I want you guys to do what's called cognitive structuring. Cognitive structuring is just basically organizing the information in your head into groups, right? So you have your brain here. Well, you have your brain right over here, and you can kind of think about like, different parts of your brain. This part of your brain, you're thinking about these types of comma rules. This part of your brain, you're thinking about these types of comma rules, right? That's your structuring information cognitively. Cognitive just means like your thinking or your thought process, and structure just means to structure, right? To kind of organize or to build. So you want to kind of create this cognitive structure to learn commas from. Okay, now what does that mean? What does that look like? Well, instead of just learning comma rules really randomly, you want to group commas based on like buckets. I call them buckets or call them kind of categories, right? So one of those categories would be commas and lists, right? Because one of the ways that you use commas is to separate items in a list, right? To separate words in a list, right? So that's one bucket or one group. You can also use commas when you're dealing with information between independent clauses. Okay. The third bucket is commas before and after independent clauses. Okay, so now this is where we're getting into different components of a sentence, right? So when I mention different components of a sentence, we're talking about, different parts of a sentence, right? We're talking about there's 5 parts of a sentence that you want to learn really well for the SAT. Those are independent clauses, dependent clauses, phrases, we have lists, and we have adjectives in a list. Those are your 5 parts or 5 components of a sentence, right? Well, we can use commas to separate one component from another component. So oftentimes you're going to see like a dependent clause that comes before an independent clause. And in those kind of cases, you want to use a comma to separate the dependent clause before the independent clause, right? Or sometimes you want to use a comma to separate the independent clause and the phrase that comes after the independent clause, right? So this is what I mean when I say before and after independent clauses, right? Is that commas are going to be used to separate components, right? Different components of a sentence, okay? Last sort of bucket or last category of commas is like commas within, right, independent clauses. So what this basically means is sometimes you're going to be using commas to separate components, right? To kind of put like a phrase inside of an independent clause. So here you're not separating one component like an independent clause from another component like a dependent clause, but in this case you are kind of putting in one component like a phrase inside of one independent clause. Okay? So these are the 4 different sort of buckets or categories that you can think about commas from. Now, within each category, we have specific rules, right? So within lists, we can think of now lists of adjectives and adjectives in a list, right? So now we're kind of grouping our information together. You can kind of see how we're structuring information in our minds to be organized, right? This will help you guys to learn comma rules a lot more easily and remember it, right? A lot more regularly or quickly on the test. Because if you have to spend like 5, 10, 15 seconds thinking about what the comma rules are, and if you're not able to kind of access that information really quickly in your brain, right, on the test, you're going to have a hard time managing your time on the SAT, right? So this will help you guys out, right, to recall that information, to remember comma rules quickly and easily and accurately on the test. We also have, right, so we have like commas, and fanboys words, right, to separate 2 independent clauses. Now we're getting into other types of punctuation marks, right? Like now we can start grouping semicolons and periods and this type of comma rule together, right? So you can kind of see how we're not just learning randomly now, right? We're learning in an organized way, in a way that makes sense, right? This is cognitive structuring. We also have like before and after independent clauses, right? Where we talked about different components like a DC, that's called a dependent clause, right? That comes before an independent clause, right? So we have to use a comma to separate that, right? What about when we have DCs that come after independent clauses? Do we need a comma then? Right, so these are the sort of rules that you want to be thinking about, but the way that we're thinking now is very organized. Can you guys see that? Right? And then lastly would be within independent clauses, right? So this is where we start to get into what's called non-essential information, right? So we have to learn about the different types of non-essential information, right? And we can also group other punctuation marks that are used for the same purposes, right? So parentheses and dashes can also be used to separate or to create non-essential information in a sentence. So just like we can use 2 commas to separate non-essential information, we can use 2 parentheses or 2 dashes, right, to separate non-essential information as well from the main sentence. Okay, so now this is where we start to like kind of group other punctuation marks together too. Right, so first and foremost, you guys, yeah, cognitive structuring is the way that you want to learn comma rules. Okay, now let's go ahead and jump into, right, that first category or that first bucket of commas, right, for lists. Okay, now a list is just another way. So a series is another way of just saying list of items, though. So when you think of a list of items, you guys just think of a shopping list. When you guys go to the grocery store, you guys have a shopping list, right? You're like, oh, I want to buy some chicken. I want to buy some, chicken. I want to buy some chips. I want to buy some soda and water, right? So you have a list of items, right? Chicken, soda, water, chips, French fries, right? Whatever, ketchup, mustard, sandwiches, okay? I'm getting hungry now. So, there's going to be certain comma rules that you want to learn here, okay? Now, if we look at the first example sentence, the example sentence says, the ocean is home to jellyfish and octopuses. I want to bring your attentions to this part here, jellyfish and octopuses. This component is called a list, okay? So now, this is what I mean by a component of a sentence, right? A list of items is a component or a part of a sentence, right? Now, you're going to have to get really good at identifying, right, or finding different components of a sentence when they appear on a sentence on the SAT. Okay, now, why is it important for you to identify a list? Well, it's important because we have comma rules that can kind of be, that can be tested when we have a list, right? So if you notice here, you guys, right, what do you notice about a list? So one of the most important things to know when we have a list is going to always be created from or with connecting words, right? So the word and here is a connecting word. Okay, now connecting words don't always have to be like and, right? Connecting words could also be words like but or, but and is the most common type of connecting word. So connecting words will be used to create lists, okay? Now, secondly, let me ask you this question, you guys, is how many items do you have in this list? How many items are there in this list? Think about it for a second. And say it out loud, right? If you guys said 2 items, fantastic, right? So 2 items is absolutely correct. What's the first item in this list? The first item is jellyfish, right? What's the second item? The second item is octopus. So this list of items is created from just single words, right? These are just single words, a single word list, right? And there's only 2 of them, right? And this list is made up of like animals, right? Or marine animals, water animals is it, okay? Now, here's one of the comma rules, you guys. Comma rule number 1 is when you have 2 items in a list. So when there are only 2 items in the list, we do not put commas between each of the items. So notice how there is no comma between jellyfish and octopuses, right? There's no comma here, right, to separate these items. Okay, that is grammatically correct. Okay, so the punctuation rule, when we have 2 items in the list, we don't use a comma to separate the items. Okay, now take a look at the next sentence here, you guys, right? Now it says, the deepest parts of the ocean reveal alien-like organisms, plants that glow in the dark, and rocks shaped by volcanic activity. Let me ask you guys a question. Do you notice the list? And just with your finger here, I want you guys to underline, right, the list. Identify the list. Okay, if you guys said from alien-like organisms all the way to the end of the sentence, you guys would be correct. This is your list. This is your list of items, though. Okay. What's the connecting word that connects these items in the list? The connecting word is going to be and, right? Now, let me ask you guys this question, is how many items are there in this list? How many items are there in this list? You guys can kind of read it. You guys might need to read it over again, and that's okay. If you guys said there are 3 items in the list, that would be absolutely correct, right? What's the first item? The first item is alien-like organisms, right? The second item is plants that glow in the dark. And the third item is rocks shaped by volcanic activity, right? So this list is just kind of made up of things, right? Like organisms, plants, and rocks, like things, but also with some kind of descriptor words, right? Like descriptions about these things. It's not just organisms, it's alien-like organisms. It's not just plants, it's plants that glow in the dark, right? These are words that describe the things, right? It's not just rocks, it's rocks shaped by volcanic activity. Okay, so, unlike what we saw in the first sentence, this list is not just created from single words, but this list is created from phrases or groups of words. So that's what you can also notice too, right? Like items or lists are not just created from single words. Lists could also be created from groups of words, right? Or that are called phrases, okay? Now, this is another comma rule that you want to write down. So the comma rule is when you have more than 2 items in the list. In other words, when you have 3 or 4 items in a list, you want to always put commas between each item in the list. Let me say that again. When you have more than 2 items in the list, you want to put commas to separate each of the items in the list. So notice how we have this comma here that separates the first item, organisms, from the second item, plants. And then notice how we have this comma here. Make sure to put the comma before the and as well to separate the second item, plants, from the third item, rocks. Okay? And so that's the comma rule here. If there's only 2 items, no comma. If there's 3 or more items, you want to put a comma between each of the items in the list. Okay, now to go one step further for you guys, because I want to give you guys that 99th percentile education, is lists can also be created from complete sentences or independent clauses. Okay, so what are independent clauses? An independent clause is just a complete sentence, right? A complete sentence has 3 things in it. A complete sentence has a subject, it has a verb, and it has a complete thought. Right, so notice here how we have the northern lights dance across the sky. The northern lights is my subject. Dance is my verb, right? The northern lights dance across the sky is my complete sentence or my independent clause. That's going to be one item in the list. The second item in the list is my second independent clause here. Animals in the Arctic adapt to freezing temperature. This is also an independent clause, right? My second item in the list, right? Now, animals in the Arctic is my subject. Adapt is my verb, right? Animals adapt to freezing temperature is my complete thought, right? So I have a second item here as well. And then lastly, I have another independent clause at the very end, is explorers journey north to witness these wonders, right? So we have independent clause number 3. Explorers would be my subject. Journey would be my verb. Explorers journey north to witness these wonders is my third independent clause. So this list has 3 independent clauses in it. So also make sure to note that the punctuation rule, the comma rule, still applies. Notice how there's a comma here to separate the first item from the second item. Notice how there's also a comma here before the and to separate the second item from the third item in the list. Okay, so that's going to be that first sort of bucket, right? We have a list of items and we have 2 comma rules that we got from there. Moving on, you guys, let's go ahead and jump into what are called adjectives in a list. Okay, so this is another component that you're going to have to be aware of in any given sentence on the SAT. You're going to have to be able to identify when adjectives in a list, when this component appears. So what does this component look like? What are the characteristics of this component, right? So it kind of is what it sounds like. Adjectives in a list is basically when you have a list, right, of adjectives that describe the same noun. So in other words, we're going to have like something like this, an adjective plus an adjective. Sometimes you might have more than 2 adjectives, right? But I'll just put 2 here. plus a noun. So you're going to have like multiple adjectives that describe the noun here. So you're going to have this phrase or this group of words that begins, right, or that always ends in a noun. You're going to have adjectives that describe that noun. Okay, this is that component that you want to be able to identify. I call this adjectives in a list, right? So if we take a look at this example sentence here, it says, the rainforest is home to very cute, colorful animals that thrive in its dense vegetation. So if you guys take a look at here, very cute, colorful animals. Okay, this is the adjectives in a list component here. Okay, now notice how we have cute is adjective 1, right? Colorful is another adjective, and it ends in a noun, right? Animals is my noun. Okay, and sometimes you might even have like adverbs as well, right? Adverbs like very, right? That might also be kind of, grouped together in that you might see within this component. Just know that you don't always have to see it. Sometimes it does show up though. Okay. And I do want to kind of mention some comma rules that are going to be important when you do notice adverbs, right? In this component. Okay. So a couple of things that I want you guys that I want to note here. So we have some comma rules coming right off the bat. Okay. So first comma rule, you guys, is this is a comma don't. This is a comma don't. Okay. So do not, right? Do not put a comma between an adverb and an adjective. Okay. So you never, ever, ever put a comma between an adverb and an adjective though. Okay. You never do that, right? So sometimes the SAT might put a comma here between the adverb very and the adjective cute. You never do that though, right? If you do notice a comma between an adverb and an adjective, it's going to be wrong immediately. Okay. So never, ever, ever put a comma between an adverb and an adjective. It's going to be first rule. Second comma rule here is you never. Now I know never is a strong word, right? But I'm using it here. You never, ever, ever put a comma between an adjective and the noun that it modifies. You never put a comma between the adjective and the noun that it modifies. Okay, so here we have the adjective colorful and the noun animals, right? Sometimes the SAT might put a comma here. If they put a comma between the adjective and the noun that it modifies, this is going to be wrong immediately. Okay, so you never put a comma between an adjective and the noun that it modifies. Okay, now the third comma rule here is, well, what do we do? When do we put commas between adjectives? So when we have adjectives in a list, when do we put a comma between these adjectives, right? And so this is a comma rule that's kind of difficult for a lot of students to understand. It's difficult for me to understand as well, right? So the comma rule is this. It says, you put a comma between two adjectives that are unrelated to each other. So when these two adjectives are unrelated to each other, right, we do want to add, right? We do want to add a comma between these two adjectives. But it's very difficult to know, right, when adjectives are related or when they're unrelated. I think that doesn't make a lot of sense, right, to a lot of people. So this comma rule is very kind of difficult to grasp, right? So the way that I teach this to make it a lot easier for my students is I teach them what you can do here is you can use what's called the and rule. Okay? There's going to be two different tests that you can use, not the and rule, but the and test. I'm sorry. The and test and the reverse the order test. Okay, so the and test is a test that you can use to determine whether, a comma is appropriate between two adjectives. Okay, when you have adjectives in a list. Okay, so how do we figure this out? So the and test is pretty simple. So the and test just basically says you want to put the word and between the two adjectives in the list. Okay, so we want to isolate the adjectives in the list, right? So cute and colorful. Cute and colorful animals. Okay, so we can take the phrase, right? the adjectives in the list, cute, colorful animals, and then we can put the word and between the two adjectives. So cute and colorful animals. Okay, now, if this phrase makes sense, if it makes sense when you put the word and between the two adjectives, then you do add a comma between these adjectives. So you just have to ask yourself, right? So you isolate the phrase and then you read it, but read it slowly. So I'll do it with you guys. So you say cute and colorful animals, cute and colorful animals. Does that make sense to you guys? You should be like, yeah, that makes sense, right? So cute and colorful animals makes sense. And so because it makes sense, we do want to put a comma between these two adjectives, right? So notice in the original example sentence, this is correct. Notice how we have the comma between cute and colorful. This is grammatically correct, right? And that's because the and test, right, tells us it makes sense. So we do want to put a comma between these two adjectives, okay? Now, you'll be able to tell when it doesn't make sense, right? So let me give you guys an example here of when it doesn't make sense. So the sentence reads, I went to the store and bought some tasty dog treats. Okay, so identify this component here, right? Some tasty dog treats is the adjectives in a list component, right? Some is my first adjective. Tasty is another adjective. Dog is another adjective. And then it all describes or modifies the noun treats. Okay, so remember these adjectives in a list, right? They have at least two adjectives, but it always ends with a noun. Okay, and yeah. And so now what we can do, right, is we can kind of test. So the SAT is going to sometimes test you, right? Do you put commas between adjectives in a list, right? So do you put a comma between a tasty and dog, right? Well, we can check, right? So how we can check now is we can use the and test, right? So what do? We isolate the phrase tasty dog treats, right? And then we put the word and between them, okay? And then now you read it slowly, right? If it makes sense, then you put a comma between these two adjectives. If it doesn't make sense, then you don't put a comma between the two adjectives. Okay, so let's read it out loud and slowly. We say tasty and dog treats. Tasty and dog treats. Your brain goes, what? Right? You should be confused, right? Because it makes no sense. How does it make sense to say tasty and dog treats? It kind of seems like there's two different types of treats, doesn't it? Like one types of treats is tasty treats and the other types of treats is dog treats, right? So we have tasty and dog treats. It doesn't make any sense at all. So because it doesn't make any sense, we do not put a comma between these two adjectives, right? So this is why you see no comma here between tasty and dog. So this would be grammatically correct, right? It's correctly punctuated, okay? And we can do the same too with these two adjectives as well, right? So if we say some and tasty treats, some and tasty treats, your brain goes, what? That doesn't make any sense at all, right? Well, that's because it doesn't make any sense, right? So, plugging in the and test here to see if it makes sense or not, right, is a great way to learn this comma rule, okay? Now, another sort of, another test that I can give you guys, right, that you can use to see if a comma is placed correctly between two adjectives is what's called the reverse the order test, right? So reverse the order test. So reverse the order test kind of is what it sounds like. It just basically means that you're going to reverse the order of the adjectives, right? So I'll give you guys an example here. It says Preston Kyle, who worked as both an accountant and a lawyer, is now a highly respected tenure professor at a university in New Zealand. Okay, so the adjectives in the list here is going to be highly tenured, highly respected tenured professor. Okay, here we have this is an adverb, right? Highly is an adverb. Adverbs usually end at ly, right? Adverbs' job is to describe adjectives or verbs or other adverbs, but we're not learning adverbs right now, but just if you guys know adverbs, great, right? But highly is an adverb. Respected is an adjective. So highly kind of tells you how respected he is, right? How respected is he? He's highly respected, right? So that's where adverbs describe or can modify adjectives, right? Respected is an adjective, tenured is an adjective, and professor is my noun. Okay, so again, we have that component, right? The adjectives in a list component. You're going to have to be able to identify that in any given sentence, right? So now we can use the reverse the order test, right? So let's go ahead and check to see if we put a comma between these two adjectives here, right? So instead of saying respected, tenured professor, we can say tenured, respected professor. Okay, we can kind of reverse the order, right? And here's the thing. If you reverse the order of the adjectives and it makes sense, then you do put a comma between the two adjectives. But if you reverse the order of the adjectives and it doesn't make sense when you read it out loud, then you do not put a comma, no comma, between the adjectives, okay? And so depending on the adjectives in a list component that you get for a given sentence, sometimes it can be easier to use the and test, right? Other times it can be easier to use the reverse the order test, right? But to have these two tests, to know these two tests is going to be helpful, because if one test doesn't make sense to you, right, for when you're testing it out, you can use the other test, right? And then sometimes, depending on students and depending on the sentence that you're given, the and test could make more sense than the reverse the order test, and vice versa. Okay. But here, if we say a tenured, respected professor, right? Tenured, respected professor. Does that make sense to you? Some of you guys are going to be like, I'm not sure, right? I'm not sure if it does. Well, it doesn't, right? It doesn't. And if you're not sure with the reverse the order test, you can try with the and test, right? If you say respected and tenured professor, a respected and tenured professor, you're going to be like, that doesn't make any sense, because it sounds like there's two different types of professors, right? There's like one type of professor who's respected and another type of professor that's tenured. But it doesn't make any sense in the sentence, because the sentence is just talking about one professor, Professor Kyle, right? So how can you say a respected and tenured professor? That doesn't make any sense at all, right? So this is why you don't put a comma between these two items, right? But you don't put a comma between these two adjectives, right? So this would be grammatically correct. Now, that was a little bit harder to hear the reverse the order test, right? But we can try it with this one here. So instead of saying cute, colorful animals, why don't we reverse the order and say colorful, cute animals, right? They're colorful, cute animals. It makes sense, right? Makes sense. So this is why you put a comma between cute and colorful. What about the next one, right? Instead of saying tasty dog treats, what if you said dog tasty treats, right? Dog tasty treats, right? This is where you can really hear, right? It doesn't make any sense at all. It sounds ridiculous, right? Dog tasty treats doesn't make any sense whatsoever, right? This is why you don't put a comma between these two adjectives, okay? Cool. So now we have the second sort of grouping, right, for comma rules, right? We have adjectives in a list. Okay, so far we've covered everything for that first bucket, right? That first category, lists. Okay, so now let's jump into our second category, you guys, right? Now the second category is when we're dealing with commas between independent clauses. Okay, when we're dealing with commas between independent clauses. So basically you're going to have something like this: independent clause, and then you're going to be dealing with some kind of commas, right, that come between independent clauses, right? So this is where you can use commas. There is a correct way and an incorrect way to use commas between these components, right? Independent clauses. Independent clauses is the most important component to identify on the SAT, because you know that, every grammatical sentence in the English language must have at least one independent clause in it. If the sentence does not have one independent clause in it, then it's not a grammatical sentence. So it's the wrong answer. So you have to fix it, right? A sentence could also have more than one independent clause in it. And if it does, right, you can use certain punctuation marks, right, to properly punctuate, right, that type of sentence. Okay, so this comma rule we're going to be dealing with, right, commas that come between independent clauses. Now, here's the comma rule that we want to keep in mind, right? So when we have two independent clauses, right, we want to make sure to use a comma and a fanboy's word. Okay, so we want to put a comma and a fanboy's word. So a comma and a fanboy's word. You see that here, right? So what's a fanboy's word, right? So a fanboy's word is basically the seven. So fanboys is an acronym. An acronym is basically, it's a word that where each letter of the word represents another word, right? So fanboys is an acronym for the 7 coordinating conjunctions in the English language, right? So there are 7 coordinating conjunctions. Conjunctions are just kind of like those connecting words, right? So there are 7 coordinating conjunctions in the English language, right? And each of these letters in fanboys represents one of the coordinating conjunctions. Okay, so F stands for, A stands for and, right? N stands for nor, B stands for but, O stands for or, Y stands for yet, and S stands for so. Okay, so these are the 7 coordinating conjunctions in the English language. Now, why is this important to know? This is important to know because you can combine a fanboy's word with a comma. Right? A comma plus a fanboy's word, right, can be used to separate or to connect 2 independent clauses. Right? So if you have 2 complete sentences, right, instead of putting a period or a semicolon, you can use a comma, but you also have to combine it with a fanboy's word. Okay, so a comma plus a fanboy's word can be used to connect 2 independent clauses. Now let's take a look at an example here. So the example sentence says, space exploration is incredibly costly, comma, for, right? It requires advanced technology and rigorous training for astronauts. Okay, let's take a look at this, right? So space exploration is my subject, is my verb, right? Space exploration is incredibly costly. This is where the complete thought finishes. This is where I have independent clause number 1, okay? Then I also have another independent clause here. It is my subject. It's a new subject. Requires is a new verb. It requires advanced technology and rigorous training for astronauts is my complete thought. So here I have 2 independent clauses, IC1 and IC2. Notice how here we have the comma for, right? Notice here how we have comma and a fanboy's word, right? So comma for to separate these 2 independent clauses. This is grammatically correct. Okay, now when we have a comma and a for, this just means, like, for here just is a fancy way of saying because, right? So it's basically saying space exploration is incredibly costly because it requires advanced technology and rigorous training for astronauts. Okay, but because we're not using because, but we're using the fanboy's word for, we have to use a comma with that fanboy's word in order for this to be grammatical. Okay, if you only had a comma or if you only had the fanboy's word for, this would not be correct, right? These are sad faces for it's not good. It's not grammatical. Okay, so you have to have a comma and a fanboy's word, not a comma or a fanboy's word, to properly connect 2 independent clauses. Okay, so looking at another example here, we have, oh, that's more of a fancy way of saying it. We have here, it's also long. The Amazon rainforest looks like my subject, right? Is my verb. The Amazon rainforest is home to thousands of unique species. This is where my complete thought ends, right? So you can kind of tell because you say, and many of them are, you have like a new subject, right? You have a new subject and a new verb. This is how I know that my independent clause is going to end here. right? Because if you just kind of keep reading, like the independent clause does not continue on. The independent clause ends right here, right? Notice how we have here, what punctuation mark do you see after the first independent clause? Well, you notice a comma. What word do you see right after the comma? And, right? So we have a comma and, which is a fanboys word. It's the A of fanboys, right? And so now we can use a comma and to separate two independent clauses, right? And that's what we have here. And many of them are still undiscovered by scientists is my second independent clause, right? So just like how we had the comma and the for to separate two independent clauses in the previous example, we have the comma and the and to separate two independent clauses in the second example. And again, remember you guys, if you only have a comma to separate these two independent clauses, that is a sentence structure error. It's a grammar error called the run-on sentence, right? Same thing too, if you only have the word and you don't have the comma with it, that's also going to be a grammatical error, okay? It's a sentence structure error. We don't like that. Okay, so this comma rule is very important to know. The SAT does test you on this a lot. Okay, so now we're going to go one step further for you guys. I told you guys this is a master class, right? You guys are here to master comma rules. So this is where comma and fanboys word can be used to separate two independent clauses. Well, now we can start to group other punctuation marks as well, right? So we can use a comma and a fanboys word to separate two independent clauses. We could also use a period. We could use a period to separate two independent clauses. And we can also use a semicolon to separate two independent clauses. Okay, so now we learned 3 punctuation rules, right? Just from this one rule. So we can put a comma and a fanboys word, right? Or we can use a period by itself, or we can use a semicolon by itself, right? And that'll be a way to separate or connect two independent clauses too, okay? So now we have that one extra punctuation rule that we learned. We can now group this together. We can now group these 3 punctuation marks together with just this one comma rule. You guys are starting to see how this works, right? Hopefully you guys are. Hopefully you guys are learning a lot from this because this is going to be a long lesson. It's already about 50 minutes into this class, and we have some more comma rules to cover. But these ones should go relatively quickly. So we're done with that second bucket of comma rules, right? So remember, what is our first bucket? Our first bucket of comma rules is with lists. Then our second bucket is when we have two independent clauses, right? The comma that comes between two independent clauses, okay? What's the third bucket? The third bucket is when we have components, like when we have commas before and after independent clauses. Okay, so we have commas before and after independent clauses, okay? So this is where now we're going to be separating one component from another component, right? So this is where we're not separating two independent clauses, but we're separating something else, right? So we might be separating a phrase from an independent clause or a dependent clause from an independent clause, okay? So this comma rule basically is simple. It says this: when you have a dependent clause that comes before an independent clause, simple. Just put a comma to separate the dependent clause from the independent clause, okay? When you have a dependent clause that comes before an independent clause, this is called an introductory clause, an introductory dependent clause, because it introduces, right, the sentence, okay? Now, there are different types of dependent clauses in the English language. This isn't the class for it. There's another video that I made called Sentence Structure. That'll teach you guys the dependent clauses in that video. But a dependent clause is basically just an incomplete sentence, right? A dependent clause always has a verb inside of it, but a dependent clause cannot stand alone as a complete sentence, okay? So if we take a look at this example sentence here, it says, if you practice daily, your skills will improve quickly. Okay, so underline, if you practice daily, this is your dependent clause. If you just looked at this part of the sentence, you would all say this is not a complete sentence. Or you would say, oh, the sentence isn't done yet, right? If you practice daily, your brain goes, wait a second, there should be more, right? That's what a dependent clause is. It's incomplete, okay? But remember, like I told you guys, a dependent clause always has a verb in it, right? Practice is your verb in the dependent clause, okay? And then now we have our independent clause here. Your skills will improve quickly. This is our independent clause, right? How do we know that? Well, independent clauses have a subject, your skills, has a verb, will, right? And it has a complete thought. So if we only looked at this part of the sentence, your skills will improve quickly, this is a complete sentence. So we don't really need the dependent clause, right, for this sentence to be a complete sentence. But we do use dependent clauses just to make, just to create more information for the reader, just to kind of provide more details. But when we look at it grammatically, we do not need dependent clauses in order for the sentence to be grammatically correct, right? We need independent clauses, right? We need a complete sentence, not an incomplete sentence, okay? But when we do have a dependent clause in the sentence that comes before the independent clause, we want to put a comma to separate them. So real simple, right? That's why we have a comma here to separate this dependent clause from the independent clause, okay? And it's, again, no big secret. It's pretty much, the same thing. Although, so you guys can read this or pause this on your own, right? Try to identify where the dependent clause is. Try to identify the independent clause, right? Now, oftentimes what you're going to notice, you guys, is punctuation marks are used to separate one component from another component, right? So punctuation marks can be used to separate a dependent clause, one component, from an independent clause, another component, right? It can be used to separate a phrase from a dependent clause, right? So punctuation marks, like commas, can be used to separate components, right? So that's why you kind of see, like, me kind of stopping at the punctuation mark, right? Because usually this is going to be one component, not always, right? Because when we have a list of items, right? Remember how we have commas that separate the words in that list, right? But here, when we have these other components, right? The commas are used usually to separate one big component from another one, right? So here, when we say, although the castle is centuries old, right, that's going to be my dependent clause. And the reason I'm kind of stopping here is because the comma kind of separates this component from this other component, right? It still stands as a remarkable feat of architecture. So what is this component, you guys? Is this a dependent clause or independent clause? It's an independent clause, right? How do we know that? Because it has a subject, it has a verb, stands, right? It stands as a remarkable feat of architecture is my complete thought, right? So if we only looked at this part of the sentence, right, this would be a grammatical sentence. It'd be a complete sentence, right? But because we have a dependent clause that comes before that independent clause, we have to use a comma to separate the two, okay? So this comma rule is pretty straightforward. Everyone should know this. If a dependent clause comes before an independent clause, put a comma to separate the two. What about when we have a dependent clause after the independent clause? Right, so what about when we have an independent clause that comes before our dependent clause? Okay, well, usually this is where the SAT rarely tests this, right? But you do not need a comma, right, when the dependent clause comes after the independent clause. It's just good to know. Okay, so here we say, he took his time. He took his time as my independent clause. Now you see how we have it backwards, right? Or we have it flipped. The previous example, we had our dependent clause come before the independent clause. Here we have our independent clause that comes first, right? So he took his time is my independent clause. If I only looked at this part of the sentence, I would have a complete sentence, right? He would be my subject. Took would be my verb. He took his time. Complete sentence, right? But here I have a dependent clause that comes afterwards, right? And I know that because is a connecting word, right? Is a subordinated conjunction that creates a dependent clause, right? Because he wanted, right, to get everything right. Because he wanted to get everything right. So this is where I have my dependent clause, right? So notice how the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, right? And notice how if we just looked at this dependent clause here, right, because he wanted to get everything right, it wouldn't be a complete sentence. And so remember, dependent clauses are not complete sentences, right? They cannot stand alone as a complete sentence. Also remember that dependent clauses always must have a verb inside of it. Okay, always have a verb inside of it. Okay, the SAT will test you on this. They're going to create sentence structures where dependent clauses do not have a verb inside of it, and your job is to fix that. Okay, so keep that in mind. Dependent clauses must always have a verb inside of it. And just know that here, we don't have a comma to separate or when a dependent clause comes after the independent clause. Okay, so this is, sometimes you might have a comma to separate the dependent clause, but the SAT won't test you on that. Okay, so notice how here we have another dependent clause that comes after the independent clause. Here we have, I had no clue how the magician performed the trick. So how the magician performed the trick would be my dependent clause, right? And notice how it kind of connects to the independent clause. I had no clue, right? Notice how there's no comma here between the two. Okay, so again, when the dependent clause comes after the independent clause, no comma is going to be necessary here though. All right. Now, next one, what about when we have phrases? So a PH stands for a phrase. And a phrase is one of those, another component in the English language, right? So we have a phrase, a dependent clause, and independent clause now. So a phrase is just nothing more than a group of words, right? A phrase, you guys, is also an incomplete sentence. But the difference between a phrase and a dependent clause is a phrase does not have a verb inside of it. So a phrase will never have a verb in it, but a dependent clause and an independent clause always have verbs inside of it. Okay, so it's just good to kind of know, a good tip to know when you're dealing with tricky sentence structure questions on the SAT. Okay, so now here's the thing, you guys, simple rule. When you have a phrase that comes before an independent clause, right, we put a comma to separate the phrase from the independent clause. When we have a phrase that begins a sentence, this is called an introductory phrase because it introduces the sentence, right? And now here, so in this example sentence, it says, at the edge of the rainforest, right? This is going to be my phrase, okay? And notice how this phrase is just nothing more than a group of words, right? At the edge of the rainforest, and it doesn't have a verb inside of it. There's no verb, right? This is how you know it's a phrase and not a dependent clause, okay? And then now notice how you have, the cabin stood hidden among the trees. This is going to be your independent clause. How do you know this is independent clause? Because you have the subject cabin, and then you have the verb stood. The cabin stood hidden among the trees is my complete sentence, right? So this is going to be my independent clause, right? Notice how you have this comma that separates the phrase from the independent clause right here, okay? Really straightforward. Now, the thing is, guys, sometimes, so how do you know this comma is going to be used to separate the phrase from the independent clause? Well, part of it is, when you read the sentence, you wouldn't read this like it's one fluid thought, right? You wouldn't read this together. You wouldn't say like the forest, the forest, the cabin. You wouldn't say at the edge of the forest, the cabin, the forest, the cabin. You wouldn't read this like it's one connected thought, right? That's how you kind of know that there should be a break, right? Or a pause between this information, right? So this is how you know that like the comma is going to be placed here to separate the phrase from the independent clause, okay? Now, you might also sometimes see, this is in the real world, you might sometimes see no comma, right, to separate the phrase from the independent clause, right? Now so there's a sort of kind of not an exact hard and set rule, but sometimes when you have fewer than 4 words, you don't have to put a comma to separate the phrase from the independent clause. So when you have like only 3 words, if you say something like on Sunday, right, or in the morning, or when you have like fewer than 3 words in the phrase, you don't always need a comma to separate the phrase from the independent clause. Just know, the SAT doesn't test you on that, but just know that sometimes you can see that when you read like articles or when you just read like stuff in the real world. Okay, but the SAT won't test you on this, but it's just good for you guys to know, right? Just for your knowledge sake. So you don't go crazy. Be like, how come there's no comma here? There has to be a comma here. It doesn't always work like that. Okay. And just look at this sentence here too, where it says to learn more about marine life. The students visited the aquarium. So guys, let me ask you guys, well, what's the independent clause? The independent clause is the students visited the aquarium, right? What's the phrase? the phrase is going to be to learn more about marine life, right? So again, here we have the comma to separate the phrase from the independent clause, okay? What about a phrase after the independent clause, right? So this is where we have a sentence structure that kind of goes like this, right? So now here, this is where it's kind of interesting. So if we put a comma here to separate the independent clause from the phrase, right, that's going to create a different meaning of a sentence sometimes than if we don't put a comma between the phrase and the independent clause. Okay, so it just depends on the sentence that's written, but sometimes, right, it's going to change the meaning of the sentence, right, if you put the comma between the independent clause and the phrase versus when you don't put the comma between the independent clause and the phrase. Okay, so I'll give you guys an example here, okay? So it says, the sentence says, I tripped over a branch running home from school. Okay, so notice how we have the independent clause here. I tripped over the branch. What's the subject of the independent clause? The subject is I. What's the verb? Tripped, right? Where does this thought end? At branch, right? I tripped over a branch. And this is where my complete thought finishes, okay? So I have my independent clause there. And now I have this ing phrase, right? I have this ing phrase, right? Running home from school, okay? Now, this is going to be a very common sentence structure pattern that you're going to see on the SAT, where you have like an independent clause, comma, like an ing phrase, you know, or sometimes like a past participle phrase, right? So the SAT likes to create these types of sentence structures just because it's a little bit harder. Like students aren't as familiar with it, right? But just know that it is acceptable. You can have this, you know, independent clause, comma, ing phrase. It is a grammatical sentence. Even though it sounds a little bit awkward or unfamiliar to you, just know that it's okay, right? And I'll teach you guys exactly how you know it's okay, right? Just right in a few seconds. So here we have this ing phrase. Ing words, this is called a participle, but more specifically, this is called a present participle. So this ing words are present participles. So this is a present participle phrase, okay? Now, present participle phrases act like modifiers, right? They act like modifiers. So let me just ask you guys this question. Who was running home from school? So if you just read the sentence, right, and think to yourself logically, right, who was running home from school? You would say, oh, it was I, right? I was the one who was running home from school, right? You guys would all see that, right? Good. And so this is where putting the comma here is really important, right? Because when you put the comma here to separate the independent clause from the ing phrase, now you're indicating that this ing phrase is referring to or modifying the subject I. However, if you did not have this comma, between the independent clause and the ing phrase, which sometimes you might not, right? Then this would indicate that it was the branch that was running home from school. Can you guys see a problem with this? Right? Can you see a problem with the branch running home from school? Does that make any logical sense to you? You should say, no way, right? Of course it wasn't the branch that was running home from school. It was I. I was the one who was running home from school, right? So this is why it's important sometimes to have a comma, right, to separate the independent clause from the ing phrase, okay? Now, this is going to be for trickier SAT grammar questions, right, for the harder ones, but this is just a good ones to know, right? The second example sentence, well, same thing. We're just using a different type of participle phrase, right? So this sentence says, the chef prepared the dish. This is going to be your independent clause, right? The chef is my subject, prepared is my verb. The chef prepared the dish would be my complete sentence, right? Now look here, you guys, we have inspired by traditional recipes passed down for generations. So inspired here is not an ing word, but it's still what's called a participle, right? But it's called the past participle. So there's two different types of participles in the English language, present participles and past participles. Present participles are ing words. Past participles are not. They have different forms to it, right? But past participles can also create participle phrases or phrases, right? So these are also can act like modifiers, right? So if I just ask you guys this question, guys, who was inspired? Who was inspired by traditional recipes passed down for generations? Who was inspired? You guys would all say what? Oh, of course, logically, it would have to be the chef, right? The chef was the one who was inspired by traditional recipes, right? That makes logical sense, right? Aha. So this is why you have to put the comma here, right? Between your independent clause and your past participle phrase. Why? Because if you don't have the comma here between a dish and inspired, then this would indicate that the dish was the one that was inspired by recipes. But that doesn't make any sense. How can the dish be inspired? Right? The dish can't be inspired by recipes. It's the person. The person has to be the one who's inspired by recipes, not the dish, right? So this is why, you would have to have this comma here to separate your independent clause from the phrase, okay? So this is a good rule to know because this is a common type of sentence structure that the SAT likes to do, right? Independent clause, comma, phrase. If you see it, though, just know it's not it's not wrong. It's an acceptable sentence structure, right? And now you know how it kind of works, right? How it kind of is how it modifies, right? The subject of the sentence, okay? Now, nextly, you guys, and I think we can kind of get into this because this is a master class. So we are going to go through all of this in one sitting. It's going to be a long video. We're going to power through this though. If you guys need a pause and take a break, please do. I'm going to take a little sip of my energy drink because I've been talking nonstop for an hour and 10 minutes. So give me 1 second. Cool. So now you guys, we're going to go into our fourth category, okay? So you think about how we're organizing our comma rules. What do we have first? And actually, guys, I would recommend studying this way. Every 25 minutes or so, pause the video and then ask yourself, what did I learn? Try to think about what you learned, right? Then during the last 25 minutes. Like you have to practice self-studying. Quiz yourself, right? What did you learn the last 25 minutes? That'll be a nice way for you to remember the information for the long term, okay? But remember what we've done up to this point is we've grouped commas in different categories, right? This is called cognitive structuring, right? Where we're kind of grouping our information in different buckets in our mind so our mind stays organized. That first category is what? With lists, right? The second category is we have between independent clauses. The third category is before and after independent clauses. And then the fourth category now is going to be inside of independent clauses. Right? So this is where you guys, right? We have an independent clause that's split up. And we have this component, right? It's called non-essential information, but we have these words that are going to come inside of an independent clause. Right? So we have part of an independent clause. Usually this is going to be the subject of the independent clause. And then we're going to have a comma. Then we're going to have what's called non-essential information. Then we're going to have another comma. And then we're going to have the rest of the independent clause, right? Which is usually going to be the verb plus the complete thought. Okay, so this is going to be the general sentence structure pattern that you're going to see, right, for comma rules that are tested in this way. Okay, so whenever we have information, whenever we have a group of words, right, that's being used inside of an independent clause, right, we're going to want, that's called non-essential information, okay? And we're going to want to surround that non-essential information with commas. So this comma here is going to be, the purpose of this comma is going to be used to open the non-essential. It begins the non-essential, right? It begins or starts the non-essential information. And then this comma here is going to be used to close the non-essential, right? Or it basically just ends the non-essential, okay? So we have two commas that are going to surround the non-essential information. And this non-essential information is going to be placed inside of a sentence, okay? So we'll take a look at examples here real quick. So the first example is, and I've kind of labeled, I kind of color-coded it for you guys so you guys can easily see it here. But for the other future examples, it won't be color-coded. And of course, for the SAT, it won't as well. I just wanted to do this to make it easier for you guys to see, right, this type of information. Non-essential information is one of the hardest things to learn about commas. You have to memorize different types of non-essentials, and this is what we're going to talk about here. We're going to talk about the different types of non-essential information that you will be tested on, okay? I just want to first teach you guys what non-essential information is. Okay, so we'll take a look at an example first. So the first sentence says, Jack's mother, comma, the head doctor at Regency Hospital, comma, was often late to pick her son up from school because of staff and patient meetings. Okay, so notice how we have this non-essential information, right? The head doctor at Regency Hospital, right? How that's going to be surrounded by these two commas here, okay? And notice how it's going to come inside of this independent clause, right? Jack's mother is my subject. Was is my verb, right? Was late to pick her son up from school because of staff and patient meetings is the rest of my sentence, okay? So look at, guys, if you ignore the non-essential information, right? If you ignore the non-essential information and read around it, you're just going to have an independent clause, right? So Jack's mother was often late to pick her son up from school because of staff and patient meetings. That's just a complete sentence right there, right? Non-essential information just kind of comes inside of that independent clause, right? That's what's happening here, okay? And you'll see that second example, same thing, right? The museum's main exhibit, which features ancient Egyptian artifacts, attracts thousands of visitors each year, okay? The museum's main exhibit is my subject. Then we have this comma that opens the non-essential, right? Which features ancient Egyptian artifacts. This comma closes the non-essential, and then we have the verb, right? Attracts, and then we have the complete sentence, right? Attracts thousands of visitors each year, right? So the non-essential information just comes inside of this independent clause, okay? Now, what exactly is non-essential information? So this is where you guys, I'm going to get a little bit technical, but this is great to know, okay? So there are two pieces of information. Well, there's kind of three pieces of information that can help you guys to figure out whether something is non-essential in a sentence, okay? So the first has to do with how it sounds. So when information is non-essential, when non-essential information is placed inside of a sentence, it's going to sound off. It's going to sound like there should be some kind of break or some kind of interruption between the words in the sentence. So in other words, you wouldn't read the sentence like Jack's mother, the, right? You wouldn't read it like Jack's mother, the. You wouldn't say mother, the head doctor. You wouldn't read it like it's one connected thought, right? Instead, it kind of sounds like there should be a break or an interruption between these words. Kind of sounds like you should pause after mother, right? So when you read the sentence, you should say, Jack's mother, the head doctor at Regency Hospital, was often late to pick her son up from school because of staff and patient meetings, right? So on one level, right, non-essential information kind of sounds like it should be interrupted, right? There should be a break or a pause between words. Okay, so that's one kind of clue that can tell you that you might have non-essential information inside of a sentence, okay? The second one is a little bit more technical, or a lot more technical. So the second one is this. Non-essential information just basically says, if you remove the non-essential information from the sentence is still grammatically correct, right? It's still grammatical. Grammatical sentence just basically means, right, the sentence structure is still correct. It still follows the rules of grammar, okay? And let me also combine the second rule as well. So these are going to be two things that you should know about non-essential information, right? So the first one is, if you remove the non-essential information from the sentence and you read it, the sentence is still grammatically correct, right? So if I just read around the non-essential, if I say, Jack's mother was often late to pick her son up from school because of staff and patient meetings, you'd be like, yeah, that is grammatically correct, okay? And that's great. That's another sign that it's non-essential. Now, the next thing that you want to check for then is making sure that the meaning is still intact, right? Intact just means it doesn't change, okay? So if you remove the non-essential information from the sentence, right, the meaning does not change. Because non-essential information, basically, it kind of is what it sounds like. It's information that is not essential, right? Essential means it's necessary. So if it's non-essential, it means that it's not necessary. So basically, non-essential information just gives you, it's information that gives you extra details. It's kind of like fun facts, but these details are not necessary in the sentence for the sentence to be grammatically correct and for the sentence's core meaning to remain the same, okay, to remain intact, okay? So if you notice here, you guys, yeah, the core meaning of the sentence is just basically telling us that Jack's mother was really oftentimes late to pick her son up from the airport. That's the meaning of the sentence, right? That's the core meaning. Now, this meaning does not change, right? Regardless of whether we know, right, that she was the head doctor at Regency Hospital. So can you see how the head doctor at Regency Hospital, this just provides a fun fact about Jack's mother, right? She was the head doctor at Regency Hospital. But it's not necessary for us to understand the meaning of the sentence, right? Because the core meaning of the sentence is that she was late to pick her son up, right? So non-essential. So now that the meaning still remains the same, we can definitely say that, oh, okay, yes, right? This is definitely non-essential information, right? Is it? Okay, so that's how you tell technically whether something is non-essential. Yeah, if you need to listen to this part over again, you guys do so because it's very important to know because the SAT is going to test you on, right, whether information is essential or not. Okay, we're going to get through some of those right now. So we're going to talk about different types of information, different types of information, and your job on this test is going to be to determine whether that information is essential or whether that information is non-essential. Okay, now sometimes you guys, this information will always be essential. Other times this information will always be non-essential. And sometimes this information depends. Sometimes it's going to be, it depends on the sentence that's written. So this is where you're going to have to like learn extra rules, right? And this is where comma rules get extra difficult, okay? So this is where we're going to really get into the advanced stuff. But this isn't the foundational class. This is a master class teaching you all of the comma rules that you need to know, right, on this test, okay? So the first type of information that we're going to deal with is what are called appositives, right? So guys, appositives, this is just basically the second of two noun phrases, okay? So when you have two noun phrases back to back, right, the appositive is the second one. Now, the job of the appositive, what the appositive's function is to clarify or to explain that first noun. Okay, so the appositive just kind of gives us more details about or description about that first noun. Here's an example. So the sentence says, Marie Curie, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, made groundbreaking discoveries in radioactivity. Okay, so I want you guys to underline Marie Curie. This is your first noun phrase. And then here, the first woman to win a Nobel Prize. This is your second noun phrase. Notice how these two noun phrases, you guys, are back to back. They're right next to each other, right? This second noun phrase is called your appositive. So the first woman to win a Nobel Prize is the appositive. Now, the job of the appositive is to do what? It's to clarify the first noun, right? So the first woman to win a Nobel Prize just gives us extra details, or it gives you a description or a clarification about who Marie Curie was. She was the first woman to win a Nobel Prize, right? That's the job of an appositive, okay? Now, sometimes you guys, right, the appositive is going to be essential and sometimes it's going to be non-essential. So when do you tell? How can you tell? So when is the appositive essential and when is the appositive non-essential? Well, it really depends on this first noun. Okay? So you have to take a look at this first noun to determine whether the second noun, the appositive, is essential or non-essential. Now, guys, if the appositive is non-essential, we want to put commas around them, right? We want to put 2 commas around them, right? So here, a comma after Curie and a comma after Prize, right? We talked about it doesn't, so Marie Curie, we don't want to read it together, right? The should be separated from Curie, right? So this comma here is used to open the non-essential, and this comma here is used to close the non-essential because it comes right before the verb, right? Made, right? So anyways, in this case, right, these 2 commas tell us that this information is non-essential. Okay, so if information is non-essential, you want to put commas around that non-essential information. But if information is essential, you don't put commas around it. Okay, you leave it bare or blank. Okay, now how do you tell? So what do we have to do with this first noun, right? So we're basically checking whether this first noun refers to one. Okay, so guys, if this first noun refers to one, so if it refers to a singular, right, like one person, one place, one thing, right, one idea, if it refers to a singular, then the appositive is non-essential. This is your comma rule, okay? This is your comma rule. However, if the first noun refers to more than one, so if it refers to more than one, right, then the appositive is essential, which means you don't put commas around it, okay? So let's check it out here. So Marie Curie, it refers to only one, right? There's only one, there can only be one Marie Curie. Marie Curie is a person's name, right? So because it refers to only one, your appositive is non-essential, right? Which means that we put a comma here before to open the non-essential, right? The first woman to win a Nobel Prize, and a comma here to finish or to close the non-essential, is it? Okay? Let's try another example. I'll change the animation there in the future, so this doesn't take up as much time. So here we have, the book To Kill a Mockingbird is often taught in high school literature classes. So notice how, you guys, we have 2 noun phrases next to each other. The book is my first noun phrase, and to kill a mockingbird is my second noun phrase. The second noun phrase is my appositive, right? It just clarifies, it just gives me the title of the book, right? The name of the book. It clarifies that first noun, the book, okay? How do we tell if the appositive is non-essential? We take a look at the first noun, right? So when we say the book, right, guys, this can refer to more than one, right? There can be more than one book, right? There can be more than one the book. So which book are we talking about, right? Because it can refer to more than one. So because it can refer to more than one, the appositive is what? It's essential in this case, okay? So it's essential, which you notice here, there's no commas, right, that surround, right, the non-essential, the information, okay? And so in this case, because the first noun refers to more than one, right, the appositive is essential here. Now, what about this next example? What if we say, my favorite book? Okay, so now I'm making this a little bit more advanced, right? So now if I say my favorite book, To Kill a Mockingbird, is often taught in high school literature classes. Notice how we have these 2 noun phrases next to each other, right? My favorite book is my first noun. To Kill a Mockingbird is my second noun. Right now, in this case, you guys, right? My favorite book, there can only be one, right? There can only be one my favorite book, right? Because why? It's my favorite. It's a singular. When you say my favorite, right, that means just absolutely just one. So because it refers to one, right, To Kill a Mockingbird, the appositive is non-essential. which is why you see commas around it. Okay? Kind of cool, right? What about this example here? The best-selling book, To Kill a Mockingbird, is often taught in high school literature classes. Notice we have two noun phrases next to each other. The best-selling book is my first noun. To Kill a Mockingbird is my second noun, right? Now, guys, in this case, haven't you guys seen like many best-selling books? You guys have seen that title a lot, right? It seems like you guys, there's like even like a bestseller section in the bookstore, right? There's like many, many bestsellers, right? There's a New York Times bestseller, and there's just a bestseller. It's a 4-time bestseller. Right? You guys have seen bestsellers in many, many books, right? So the best-selling book can refer to more than one. Right? So it can refer to more than one, then that means that the appositive is essential. When it's essential information, right, we don't put commas around it, which is why you don't see commas around the title To Kill a Mockingbird. Okay? So that'll be for appositives, you guys, right? Capiche? You guys got it, yeah? Cool. So the second type of information here is called the which clause, okay? Now the which clause, right, is going to be, this is going to be a type of dependent clause, okay? It's a type of dependent clause. Now, again, if you guys have watched my previous videos about dependent clauses, you guys have heard me talk about the 3 different types of dependent clauses in the English language. Right? One of those types of dependent clauses that you're going to encounter very frequently on the SAT are what are called relative clauses. Relative clauses are created from relative pronouns, okay? But the which is one of these relative clauses, right? It's kind of good to know, right? Now, these which clauses, the type of dependent clause, the job of this which clause is going to be always to describe the noun that comes before it. Okay, I'll explain all of this in just a second, but just know that this which clause is always going to be non-essential information. Okay, which clauses are always non-essential when it's used as this dependent clause. Let's take a look at this example here. So it says the Eiffel Tower, which was completed in 1889, is one of the most iconic landmarks in the world. Okay, so notice how we have this component here, right? This dependent clause, this which clause. Okay? It's a type of dependent clause, which I told you guys, dependent clauses always have a verb inside of it, right? So was is my verb inside of this dependent clause, okay? Dependent clauses are not complete sentences, right? So which was completed in 1989 is not a complete sentence. Now, this type of dependent clause will always describe the noun that appears before it, right? So guys, when I ask you this question, what was completed in 1889? You guys would say, oh, it's the Eiffel Tower, right? So the Eiffel Tower was completed in 1889, right? So that's how you know, right, that you have a which clause used in this way, because it describes the noun that comes before it, okay? Now, like I told you guys, this is just a good comma rule to know. Which clauses are always non-essential. Which means what? If it's non-essential, it means, do you have commas around it? Yes or no? Yes, right? So in non-essential information, you have commas that come before it and a comma that comes after it. Okay, so if you just read it, you can kind of tell when the dependent clause ends. You'll be able to tell when this which clause finishes, right? Because it usually finishes right before the verb. And if you say, which was completed in 1889 is, oh, that's my verb of the sentence, right? So it's going to end right over here, which means you have this comma here, right? So that'll be your which clause here. So this is just non-essential information, right? Now, this is going to be different from, oh, you don't have to know this. I mean, it's the same thing, but this is going to be different from the that clause, okay? So we just looked at it. We talked about what a which clause is, type of dependent clause. It describes the noun that comes before it. Well, the that clause is the same thing, right? So the that clause is also a dependent clause. A that clause is also a relative clause. And this that clause also can be used to describe the noun that comes before it, right? So if I look at this example here, it says, the laptop that I use for work needs a new battery, right? So you see this that clause? So this that clause begins right over here. And then where does it end? that I use for work needs. Nope, right over here. It ends right here. So this is going to be the that clause. Now, again, this that clause, it describes the noun that comes before it, right? So it's describing the laptop. Right? So which laptop are you talking about? Are you talking about the laptop that I left at home? Nope. I'm talking about the laptop that I use for work. That laptop, right? So we know these that clauses will describe the noun that comes before it, right? Now, the thing about this that clauses, you guys, these that clauses are always essential, okay? So it's the opposite of the which clause, right? So the which clause is always non-essential, which means that you put 2 commas around it, but the that clause is always essential, which means you do not put commas around it, right? So you leave it kind of bare. So this is where you might see the SAT, right, create wrong answer choices that might put a comma here, might put a comma here. So your job is to recognize that this is a violation of the comma rule. You should not put commas before or after that clauses, right? Because that clauses are always essential, okay? So this is where it becomes really, really important, you guys, for you guys to be able to identify different components or different parts of a sentence, right? This is why I'm saying, dependent clauses, these that clauses, lists, right? These are all going to be super important because the SAT will test you on these components in very sort of tricky ways, okay? Take a look at this sentence here. It's a good one to do. I finally found the keys that I lost last week. Because let me ask you guys, where is the that clause? Where does it begin? That, right? Where does it end? That I lost last week. It ends right over here at the end of the sentence, right? So what is this describing? It's describing the keys, right? Which keys are you talking about? Are you talking about the keys that you left in your car? Nope, not that one. Are you talking about the keys that you left at the bar? Nope, not that one. I'm talking about the keys that I lost last week. Those keys, right? The keys that I lost last week, okay? Again, these that clauses are always essential information, which is why you do not see a comma, right, before it, okay? That'll be just good to know there. Now, what about the who clause, right? So the who clause is also going to be a type of dependent clause, right? A type of relative clause. These who clauses also describe the noun that comes before it, right? So if I say the student who won the competition received a scholarship. So who won the competition would be my who clause here. Well, what does it describe? It describes the student. Which student am I talking about? I'm talking about the student who won the competition, okay? So now these who clauses, these ones depend on the context of the sentence that you're given. So these ones are trickier, right? Because that clauses are always essential, which clauses are always non-essential, but who clauses depends. It can be either or, right? So you just really have to look at the sentence that you're given, right, on that, for that particular question, okay? So this is how you can tell here. So, I'll give you guys a couple of ways to figure out whether this, to help you to figure out that whether this is essential or non-essential. Okay, so the first is, if it specifies the type of noun. Okay, so here, notice how if I say the student who won the competition received a scholarship, who won the competition is my who clause. It really specifies the type of student, right? So which student are you talking about? Are you talking about the student who's in 8th grade? Nope, not that one. Are you talking about the student who got kicked out of school? Nope, not that one. I'm talking about the student who won the competition. I'm talking about that student there. Okay, so when we have this who clause that specifies the type of noun, right, this is going to be essential information. It's always essential. Right now, why? So remember, if it's essential, we don't put commas around it, right? Which is why you don't see any commas before or after it, right? Now, why is it essential here? Because we talked about earlier, one of the characteristics of non-essential information is, well, hey, if you remove the non-essential information from the sentence and you read the sentence, the meaning remains the same, right? Well, if we read the sentence without the who information, we're testing whether it's essential or non-essential. We can test it out. It says the student received a scholarship. You're like, oh yeah, well that's grammatically correct. So that part of it's okay, but does the core meaning change? Does the core meaning of the sentence change? Well, we would say absolutely it does, right? The core meaning absolutely changes because when we say the student received a scholarship, that's different than saying the student who won the competition. Right? If I say the student who won the competition received the scholarship, right? That meaning is much more clear. It's much clearer than if I just say the student received a scholarship. Okay, so the core meaning does change. Why? Because it becomes less clear. It becomes less clear when we take out that information, right? So that's how you know that this information is essential. You need it because the core meaning is going to change. It becomes less clear when we take it out, right? If we treat it like it's non-essential. So this is why we want to treat this like it's essential information and don't put commas around it, okay? What about this sentence here? So here we have my grandmother, who turned 90 this year, still enjoys gardening. Okay, so we have this who clause, who turned 90 this year. Who is it talking about? It's talking about my grandmother, right? It's describing her. Now notice here, you guys, a couple of things, right? We know that, well, there's a couple of things, right? So we talked about how non-essential information, you can kind of tell based off of like how it sounds, right? Now, in this case, you guys try it out. When you say my grandmother who, would you read this like it's one connected thought, or would you read it like it should be separated? There should be a pause. Would you say my grandmother who, my grandmother who, or would you read it like my grandmother who turned 90 this year still enjoys gardening? You would pause, right? That's different from saying the student who versus my grandmother who, right? It's different. Yep. So there's one level. On that one level, you can kind of tell that it's non-essential because it sounds like there should be a break, right? Or like a disruption or a pause between these words. Like you wouldn't read it like it's one connected thought, right? We can also apply the specific technical rules, right, for non-essential information here as well. So we said that, we talked about it here. Well, my grandmother refers to just one, right? Refers to one. So we know that, right, when it refers to one, then this information, this who clause is going to be non-essential, right? We talked about that with the positives. But we can also look at non-essentials in this way too, right? So if we read the sentence without the non-essential, right, is it still grammatically correct? Well, it says my grandmother still enjoys gardening. Yep, that's grammatically correct. Does the core meaning change? Does the core meaning of the sentence, does it change or does it remain the same? Right? It remains the same, right? It does not change, right? Because why? The core meaning of the sentence is that your grandmother loves gardening. So whether or not we know she's 90 years old this year does not matter, okay? Because that does not affect the core meaning of the sentence. You still know the sentence is still clear because you still know who you're talking about, right? It's my grandmother. There's only one, right? And we know that the core meaning is that she still enjoys gardening. Okay, so this is why we know that this who clause is non-essential here, which is why you notice this comma here, which opens the non-essential, and this comma here, which closes the non-essential who clause. Okay, now notice how also that's different from the previous sentence where if we got rid of this who clause, the sentence becomes less clear, right? The meaning becomes less clear, right? Because now we don't know who we're talking about because the student is very vague and very general. But when we say my grandmother, we still know who we're talking about. It's my grandmother. It's a singular, right? So this is where we know that this who clause in the second example is going to be non-essential, okay? And that's how you can kind of tell those different levels, whether or not the who clause is essential or non-essential, all right? We can try this one here too, you guys. You can pause it if you guys want to and then come back to it to hear my explanation for it. But we should all know that this is going to be essential, right? Can you guys tell me where does the who clause begin? It begins at who, right? Usually it begins at who, not always though. Where does it end? If you just read it, you can just tell when it ends, where it ends by reading it. So if you say, it usually comes before the verb, right? So it usually ends before the verb. So it says, who discovered penicillin was? Nope, not was. That's the verb, right? So it's going to end right over here. So this is my who clause here. Okay, now what does it do? Doesn't it specify? It tells us which scientist, right? Which scientist are we talking about? Are we talking about the scientist who cured cancer? Not that one. I'm talking about the scientist who discovered penicillin, right? That scientist is who I'm talking about, yeah? So because it specifies the type of scientist, right, we want to treat it like this is not essential information. Essential, which means that we don't put commas around it, okay? And you see this one here as well, right? Albert Einstein is referring to just one, right? Who developed the theory of relativity, right? This is the who clause, right? And we know here it's going to be non-essential, right? Because on multiple levels, right? Because we wouldn't read the sentence like Albert Einstein who, like it's one connected or fluid thought. There has to be a break, right? Albert Einstein, who developed the theory of relativity, right? And also we know that if we read the sentence without the non-essential information, it's still grammatically correct and the core meaning remains the same, right? Because the core meaning is still clear, right? Albert Einstein is considered one of the greatest physicists. So the core meaning is about how great he is as a physicist, right? That doesn't change regardless of whether we know he developed the theory of relativity. Right? So whether or not he developed this does not matter, right, to us. Plus, we also know that the sentence is still clear because we know that Albert Einstein is a singular, right? So we know it's him that the sentence is referring to, okay? That's why we know that this is going to be non-essential, which means that we put commas around it. You see that comma here that begins the non-essential information with the who, and then this comma here right before the verb is that ends or closes the non-essential information, okay? So that's going to be for the who clause. Guys, we only have a couple more to go to before we're done. Now, we also have transition words, okay? So these guys are going to be non-essential information. So this one is good to know. There's some technical terms to learn. So we'll take a look at that here. So guys, take a look at this example sentence. The example sentence says, the meeting, however, will still proceed as planned despite the weather forecast. Okay, so underline this word however here. This however is going to be that transition word that I'm talking about. Okay, now this type of transition word, you guys, is called a conjunctive adverb. Okay, this is a good term to know. So a conjunctive adverb is different from a coordinating conjunction. All right, so a coordinating conjunction is, remember a coordinating conjunction, you guys, this is the fanboys words. Okay, so the coordinating conjunction is the fanboys words. Conjunctive adverbs, not fanboys. Conjunctive adverbs are these guys, right? Words like however, words like for example, words like therefore, words like, you guys know these, right? Words like in fact, right? Words like for instance, words like as a result, right? These are conjunctive adverbs, you know? And so this is, kind of think about this like transition words though, okay? But they're not coordinating conjunctions. They're not words like and or but or, okay? Now, that's important to know because these conjunctive adverbs are a type of non-essential information, which means that when these conjunctive adverbs are placed inside of a sentence, right, they're going to receive commas around it. So notice how we have this comma here before however, and we have this comma here after however, okay? Now, it's important to know, you guys, right, that when you read the sentence, read around this non-essential, you notice that here we only have one independent clause, right? We have one sentence that we're dealing with, okay? So it says the meeting will still proceed as planned despite the weather forecast. This is one sentence, right? One independent clause. when we have one independent clause, right, and when this non-essential information comes inside of one sentence, we're going to want to use 2 commas, right? Okay, keep that in mind. Now, this is important to know because one of the ways that the SAT is going to trick you, told you this is the master class, right? One of the ways the SAT is going to trick you is they're going to put non-essential transition words, right, in between 2 sentences. Take a look. So this example says, she wanted to travel abroad this summer. Nevertheless, her busy schedule made it difficult. Okay. So guys, notice how we have this transition word, nevertheless. Okay, but notice how in this case, we have a semicolon and a comma. So we only have 1 comma here. Versus in the previous example, we have 2 commas, right? So why do we have just 1 comma here and we have a semicolon, right, or another punctuation here? Well, it's because if you read the sentence without the non-essential, you'll notice that you have 2 sentences, right, around it. Okay, so here, she is my subject. She wanted to travel abroad this summer is 1 sentence. Her busy schedule is another subject. Made is a verb, right? Her busy schedule made it difficult is another sentence. So here we have 2 sentences, right? Or 2 independent clauses here, okay? Now, remember, this is going back to the comma rules, you guys, right? When I told you guys, hey, we cannot just put commas. So we cannot just put commas and I'm going to say conjunctive adverb. So you cannot put a comma, conjunctive adverb, and a comma between 2 independent clauses. This is a grammatical error called a run-on sentence. Okay, remember that run-on sentence, you guys? A run-on sentence is when you have 2 independent clauses that are not properly punctuated. So remember, what are the proper punctuation marks that can be used to connect 2 independent clauses? Well, that would be what? We can use a semicolon, right? We can use a period, or we can use a comma and a fanboys word. Right? So a comma and a fanboys word can be used to separate 2 independent clauses, but we cannot use a comma and one of these transition words. You cannot use a comma and nevertheless, right, and comma to separate 2 independent clauses. That is grammatically incorrect. So when you have these transition words that come in between 2 sentences, not when it's placed inside of 1 sentence, but when it comes in between 2 sentences, you have to use a semicolon and a comma, okay? Not a comma and a comma. So the SAT will test you on this rule, so make sure to keep that in mind. One tip that I could give you guys for these types of questions is read the sentence without the transition word and determine whether you just have 1 sentence or 2 sentences in it. That should help you guys out, okay? Now, I think one of the last ones, intervening phrases, right? This is another type of non-essential information. So this one I just wanted to bring to you guys' attention because it confuses a lot of students, right? So actually, you know, it's let me jump back a little bit here. So guys, you know these transition words, right? Many students are not used to seeing these transition words inside of a sentence. Normally, where do you see these transition words? You normally see them at the beginning of a sentence, right? That's absolutely correct. You know, these transition words are kind of flexible though. So they can kind of be moved around different places in a sentence, right? So that's why it's just kind of important to know that, oh, these transition words can be placed in front of the sentence, but they can also be placed inside of a sentence, right? And when they're placed inside of the sentence, just think about them as non-essential information, okay? So that's just kind of helpful to know. Now, that's also going to help you guys out with this type of non-essential, the intervening phrases. So We'll read an example sentence, you guys, and this will help you guys to understand what intervening phrases are. Okay, so the example sentence says, the pyramids, according to historians, were built over several decades. So according to historians is your intervening phrase. So guys, an intervening phrase is basically a group of words that just kind of interrupts. It interrupts the flow of the sentence. I kind of call these interrupters. They interrupt the flow of the sentence. Okay, now more specifically, these intervening phrases, they kind of tell you the source of the information. They kind of tell you who said this or where this came from. Okay, it kind of tells you the source of the information, right? So we say according to historians. So historians were the ones who said this, right? Historians were the ones who sourced this, right? They're the ones who told us that the pyramids were built over several decades, okay? So that's what this type of non-essential information is. And again, it kind of sounds like it doesn't belong, right? The pyramids, according, you wouldn't read this like it's one connected thought. You would kind of pause. It kind of sounds like there should be a break or an interruption between these words, right? That's going to be this type of non-essential, you know? And don't think that that's really elementary, you guys. That can help. How it sounds, right? When you read it, can kind of be a nice little clue that tells you that, oh, this might be, right, non-essential information, you know? So don't just dismiss it as like a very, elementary rule. It's helpful. It's very, very helpful, you know, but I also taught you guys other sort of rules, right? Other things to keep in mind to test whether or not it's non-essential. And so that's just other things that you can do, right? I just want to give you guys as many tools in your arsenal as possible, right? To really help you guys to have the certainty, right? And the confidence, right, on this test, okay? But just notice here how we have a comma that opens up the non-essential intervening phrase, right? According, and where does it end? According to historians were, it ends right here, right? Right before the verb of the sentence, right? At historians. So this comma's purpose is going to be to close the non-essential, right? Now, if you just read around it, it's going to say, the pyramids were built over several decades, right? That reads very fluidly, you know? And we now know that, hey, this is non-essential because the meaning of the sentence still remains the same, right? Whether or not we know that the historians told us this doesn't matter, doesn't affect the meaning of the sentence, right? Because the meaning of the sentence is that the pyramids were built over several decades. It just tells us how long it took for the pyramids to be built, right? So whether or not we know who told us this doesn't matter, doesn't change the meaning of the sentence, though, okay? And that'll be this type of non-essential. So if we just take a look at there's other types too. So, these source of information, right? These interrupters, things like, in this case, many believe, right? Or you might say something like some readers claim, right? Critics argue, these are going to be the certain types of, right, intervening phrases, these interrupters, and just know that this is going to be another type of non-essential information, okay? Just like the non-essential transition, you would normally read these types of phrases at the beginning of a sentence, wouldn't you, right? You would normally read a sentence that says, some readers claim that her novel redefines the genre, right? Many believe these exercises are effective. Right? According to historians, the pyramids were built over several decades, but again, these types of non-essential information are just kind of flexible in terms of where they can be placed, right? It's just know that they can be placed inside of a sentence. When they're placed inside of a sentence, make sure to put commas around them, okay? Now, guys, the last thing that I want to do is I want to share with you guys some do's and don'ts, right, for commas. Now, these guys are important to know because it's as important that you know how commas should be used as it is to know how commas should not be used. Okay, now the reason why you want to get really familiar with how not to use commas, right, is because the wrong answer choices that the SAT creates will often have commas in these ways, right, as these violations, okay? So I want to just bring a few more do's and don'ts for commas. Basically just don'ts. I want to bring some don'ts for comma rules. and then we'll end this master class, right? And in the future video, in the next video, for commas, we'll do some training. We'll actually take a look at and solve, several comma questions back to back to back to back that'll really help to take our knowledge that we learned here and apply it, right, through actual questions on the test. Okay. So now just know that, you guys, these sentences are not correct, right? These are not grammatically correct. And I did that on purpose because these are going to be basically comma don'ts. In other words, do not use commas in this way. Okay. So the first rule is, you guys, for these comma don'ts is do not use commas before or after prepositional phrases. Okay. So a prepositional phrase, if you guys aren't familiar with this term, write it down. A prepositional phrase. A phrase is just a group of words. A prepositional phrase is just a group of words that begins with a preposition. Okay, so what is a preposition? A preposition are words like for, right? To, at. Right? These are like kind of words that just kind of describe like location, placement, position, direction, right? Like under, above, with, to, on. There's too many prepositions in the English language to memorize. Don't memorize them, but just get familiar with them, because the SAT loves to create sentences with prepositional phrases in it. Okay. Now you'll know, so something like at the bus stop is a prepositional phrase because it begins with the preposition at and it ends with the noun, right? So prepositional phrases will always end with a noun, right? For is another preposition. Over 2 hours is the prepositional phrase. To pick up his mother, right? Prepositional phrase. Okay. So the comma rule is, right, don't put a comma before or after or around prepositional phrases that belong together with the previous words. Okay, so guys, if you read this sentence, right, if you just read the sentence, you'll be able to tell whether or not this prepositional phrase belongs or blends together with the previous words. What do I mean by blends or belongs together with the previous words? Well, it kind of naturally should be read together. It should be grouped together. It should be read fluidly in that way. Okay, so for example, if I say this, Jack was waiting at the bus stop for over 2 hours. Okay, Jack was waiting at the bus stop for over 2 hours. He was waiting at the bus stop for over 2 hours. This is an example of a prepositional phrase that kind of belongs or it blends together with the previous words, right? Why? Technically, it belongs with the previous words because it specifies, right? It specifies how long Jack was waiting. So how long was he waiting? He was waiting for 2 hours. Okay? So because it specifies, because it blends together with the previous information, right? It blends together. It should be grouped together. It belongs together with the previous words, right? We should not put commas around this. It's not non-essential. It's essential. Okay? So we don't want to put commas here. So this is going to be just no commas, right? And the SAT is known to do this, you guys, right? Where the SAT is known to put prepositional phrase after prepositional phrase after prepositional phrase kind of back to back to back, just because it kind of sounds like it should be a break, but there shouldn't be. Okay, so when there's prepositional phrases that belong together, don't put commas before them or around them. Okay, that's one comma rule. Next one is this. Do not, you never, ever, ever put a comma to separate the subject from the verb. So never use just one comma to separate the subject from the verb. Okay, so we'll take a look at this example here. It says, what is quite interesting about the way Jill studies for the test is she creates songs based on the topics she will be tested on. Okay, so the subject is this entire thing. right? What is quite interesting about the way Jill studies for tests, that is the entire subject of the sentence, okay? So this comma rule says you never place just one comma. You'll never just have one comma that comes between the subject and the verb. So the verb of this sentence is, right? So you never have just one comma that comes between the subject and the verb, okay? Now, this is a great rule to know because the SAT oftentimes puts just one comma between a subject and a verb, okay? Never do that. Now, the only time that you'll have commas between a subject and a verb is when you have two commas between a subject and a verb. Right now, we saw this a lot for non-essential information, right? So it's very common for you to put, for the SAT to put non-essential information between the subject and the verb. But when you have non-essential information between the subject and the verb, you'll always have two commas, not just one comma, right? But two commas between the subject and the verb, okay? And so that's a good thing for you to know, right? You'll never just have one comma that comes between the subject and the verb, right? When you do have commas between the subject and the verb, there'll be two of them, okay? And that'll be that. The last comma rule here that you should know is this one here. The sentence reads, Mo's, so the last comma don't is, I'll write down, do not, right? Do not use a comma to separate the general term from the specific items. Okay, so if we take a look at the sentence here, the sentence reads, Mo's company sold digital devices, computers, cameras, and smartphones. Can you guys see how here, digital devices, this is the general term, right? Computers, cameras, and smartphones, these are your specific items, okay? So this comma rule says do not use a comma to separate the general term from the specific items. So in other words, do not put a comma here after devices. Why? Because it makes it seem like this devices is part of the list of items. And now that doesn't make any sense, right? Digital devices is not part of the items in the list. Digital devices is your general term, right? The items in the lists are all about the specific items, right? The types of digital devices. So computers is a type of digital devices. Cameras is a type of digital devices. Smartphones is a type of digital devices, right? So you don't want to put a comma between the general term and the specific items because it makes it seem, it's going to be a confusing sentence. It's going to make it seem like the general term is part of the list. You don't want to do that though. Okay, so in these cases, well, what should you do? Well, in these cases, you can do several things to fix this. One of the things you can do to fix this is instead of using a comma, use a colon, right? A colon, right? Because a colon can be used to create a list of items, right? You could use a dash, right? A single dash. Or what you can do is you can use what's called an introducers. You can use introducers. Introducers are words that introduce a list, right? So you can use words like such as, right? Or words like including. Now, when you do this, sometimes you might have the comma. But now this is okay, right? Because now you separate the general term with words like such as or including, and then you go right into the specific items, okay? But if you don't have the introducers, you can't just put the comma there. You have to use a different punctuation, right? And that's going to be that comma rule there, okay? Guys, that is going to do it for this master class. Hopefully you guys learned a lot. It was a 2-hour lesson. Hopefully you guys gained a lot of value from this class. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this class as much as I enjoyed making it for you. It was incredible. We didn't take a single break. You guys might have, but I kept going 2 hours straight. and it could go for a couple hours more. But you guys, I know that we're going to be done with this lesson, but I want you guys to do a couple of things. One is I want you guys to write this down in the comment section below. Write down one thing that you learned that was really helpful for you. Write that down. Also, write down one thing that you want to learn. What is something that you're having trouble with that you want to learn or get help with? What is something that you want that you're not sure about, right? That you want to learn more about, though. Okay, write that in the comment section below as well. I can help you guys out with that too. Okay. And then lastly, you guys, please do me this favor and please like and subscribe this video. Share this video with somebody you feel like who needs it. I want to try to get to as many people as possible. And this is the way that you guys can help me out, help me do so. I am committed to helping you guys get fewer than 5 wrong on this test consistently. And I would love your guys' support, right, in helping me spread this word, helping you guys get this information out to as many students as possible. Okay. As until then, and also the last thing is the next video, in a future video, I will create a video where we train ourselves, where I train you guys to solve comma questions based off of these rules that we learned. Because we didn't actually solve questions, because if we did, this would have been like a 4-hour class instead of a 2-hour class. So in the future video, we'll get into, I'll teach you guys how to solve, right, comma questions based off of these rules that we learned. So you'll start to see all the stuff that we talked about put into action. Okay. Guys, that'll do it for this lesson. Guys, again, my name is Jin's teacher. It was a pleasure teaching you guys. Make sure to always stay curious. You never stop learning, you guys, and always keep moving forward. You guys got this. Take care.